Hi everyone, this is Shane O'Grady and welcome to this presentation on the strategy lenses on behalf of accountancyschool.ie. Now the strategy lenses is certainly another one of the topics that we could consider peripheral on P3. As you can see, it's only been asked 3 times in 21 exams. However, it has been asked twice in question 1. Therefore, it's not really advisable that you would go into the exam knowing nothing about this topic, but there would be nothing wrong in you actually only having an adequate amount of knowledge about this topic. It's not maybe as vitally important to some of the other topics such as SWOT or PESTEL or 5 forces or the value chain or the cultural web, etc. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce the topic as per the syllabus, explain the theory, illustrate it maybe with some examples, review the 3 questions to date focusing on the marking scheme as part of exam technique, and work through one past question leading towards an indicative answer that I have prepared and that is in your course notes. Okay, so the syllabus is pretty straightforward. Compare 3 different strategy lenses by Johnson, Scholes and Whittington for viewing and understanding strategy and strategic management. So if you go to my course notes and you go to page 216, you will find an extract from a technical article published on behalf of the ACCA a number of years ago. So this is effectively from the ACCA itself, and therefore you can attach a lot of credibility to this because it's from the actual the source organization rather than the different views that various textbook providers might take. So very briefly, strategy as design is one of the ways in which organizations might view strategy, and the whole essence behind this particular topic is that there are basically 3 different lenses, and depending on circumstances, those lenses might be appropriate or not appropriate. I suppose the analogy here would be if you're a photographer, and a photographer maybe has a single lens reflex camera. The ones that if you think of, the professional photographers where they have a kind of a base unit, and then they can put different lenses on depending on whether they want to take a long distance shot, they want to take a wide angle shot, they want to take a close-up shot. So, the 3 lenses, using those as an example, are all perfectly appropriate lenses depending on the suitability of the situation. So if you're trying to basically get everybody in a large wedding into a shot, well then it's vitally important that you're actually using a wide angle lens rather than some sort of a telephoto lens, because it's not just going to be suitable for the situation. So it's the same approach effectively with these lenses. So strategy as design, this is a view of strategy whereby strategy development is logical and rational. So stereotypically you could say this is one maybe that accountants would be most comfortable with. So developments that arise are evaluated in a calm, objective way, and then resources are allocated and specific strategies are followed. So that's kind of one that you would say maybe an awful lot of people would be most comfortable with, particularly those from an accounting profession. Strategy as experience is quite different. It's a much different lens, and it views strategy in a completely different way. And the idea here is that it's based on an accumulation of experience. The older you are, the wiser you get as a company and as management within that company. And you adapt your strategies based on effectively what was the previous experience. You're making small, little, gentle, incremental variations of strategy. Now, again, that can be a suitable approach in the right type of circumstances, but if, for example, the organization is exposed to massive change in the macro and micro environment, well then adopting that type of a view or that type of a lens and looking at strategy in that way is wholly inappropriate, because you're not going to be just able to tweak and fine-tune past strategies. You're going to have to more radically overhaul your strategy and maybe go at things in a completely different way. So that's the idea. That could be maybe a lens that isn't suitable for an organization in a case study. So, and that view strategy is, based on kind of taken for granted assumptions, but what you take for granted in the past may no longer be sustainable in the future. I suppose you think of, the stereotype that's attached to millennials and that they don't spend too long working in one company. So, maybe that was a take it for granted assumption in an organization that when we would bring in a new cohort of people into an organization, at least a few of them would stay for 20, 30, 40 years, and they would become the senior management in the organization, and that's the way we've always viewed things. That may no longer be sustainable for a company in a modern day context. And then the last one then is strategy as ideas. So this is where strategies need to cope with uncertain, unpredictable and changing environments. So the stereotype that's always used here, for example, is a very creative type of an organization where they're having to respond to very dynamic situations, and it's very hard to predict in advance and come up with kind of a formula or a kind of a template or a flow chart as to how you will develop strategy for a given situation. What you have to do is kind of do things on the fly, think on your feet, that type of a scenario. So, if you think perhaps here of maybe 3 examples. A strategy as design, you'd imagine an engineering company would very much view strategy through that type of a lens. It's logical and rational. We've been asked by a client for them to build a bridge to span a certain river. And you evaluate the various challenges in relation to that, the quality of the soil, the flow of the river, the span. You basically plug all those things in, and then you produce a design and you implement that design. That wouldn't be a good way to approach strategy if you've an organization that very much bases their strategy on experience. So you think maybe of an organization whereby they organize concerts or some sort of an event management company, and the whole idea here is that people start off being a bit more of a kind of a novice or they're an understudy, and then over time what happens is they accumulate experience, and that experience then allows them to plan and deal with situations as they arise. And then strategy by the ideas, I suppose it's almost a lazy stereotype there, would be some sort of an advertising company, or indeed an awful lot of the IT companies in the modern environment, whereby things are unpredictable, consumer tastes and preferences are changing quite quickly, and you need to be very, very radical and very flexible and almost chaotic in the way that you develop certain strategies. Now, as you can see, they are nearly 3 extremes. And the whole idea is to try and maybe get the right blend. It wouldn't be a good idea for an engineering company to completely rely on the design lens when coming up with a strategy. They would need to surely take some cognizant of the fact that they have got engineers within their organization who are incredibly experienced and should leverage that experience. And they should also encourage perhaps ideas maybe coming from the most junior engineers and architects within the organization, and let those ideas inspire and come up with innovative solutions, and not them just using the kind of the old tired tried and tested ways of dealing with the demands that might be coming in from certain clients. Similarly, go to the other extreme. You can't have an advertising company where there's no structure, where there's no kind of thought process, or there's no kind of repeatable template and when they're doing things. Now, it might be certain elements of what the advertising company does, maybe in terms of the actual briefing document that they get from a client that has to be filled out in a particular way. And even maybe things like their billing cycle or stuff like that. But again, yes, they would mainly view strategy as an ideas, inspirational type situation, but that's not to say that they couldn't borrow or have some use for viewing strategy as experience, or then sometimes viewing strategy as design. If you go forward, backwards, shall I say, in my course notes, you'll find quite a detailed slide on page 13, which gives you a very kind of a detailed breakdown as to how you would be able to differentiate between the 3 different lenses. Now, I'm not going to drag you through that slide in this presentation. It's something you can look at in your own time, but I think at this stage, between the very short summary that I previously mentioned that's in the technical article, and hopefully through the description I've just gone through there, you should have an idea what's meant by the various different lenses. So again, strategy by design, if you think of it, let's just look at the overview. Deliberate positioning, rational, analytic, structured, and directive processes. So in certain organizations, that's definitely a way to go. In other organizations, viewing strategy in that way could quite literally destroy the organization, because it's just not suitable in the context of its own specific circumstances in viewing strategy that way. Then if we look at experience, incremental development, so again, tried and tested, The organisation puts huge value on the accumulation of experience that it has gone through, and then takes that and fine tunes it and kind of perfects their strategy on that basis. So individual and collective experience, and then the taken for granted things that we believe how people will behave in the organisation. That's viewing strategy through the experience lens. And lastly then we have the ideas, so the emergence of order and innovation through a variety and diversity around the organisation. So you'll even maybe have noticed this in your own personal experience, particularly for any of you that were doing a postgraduate course in the recent past. Universities and colleges are really actively trying to make sure that there is what they call a good class dynamic within those courses. So they try and, if at all possible, ensure that there are people within those courses that are from a variety of backgrounds, or even maybe their age profile or the stage of their career might differ, because within that type of an environment you have kind of ideas coming from a variety of people. So it's not the view that this person obviously is the most experienced and has the best, most relevant undergraduate degree, so surely they're the person who would be able to design the best solution, or they would be the person who could design or come up with the correct way of viewing something. The strategy through the ideas lens would say, look, that mightn't always be the case. What's to say that you mightn't actually have the best solution to this problem from a person who maybe doesn't fit that kind of rational, analytical, linear, structured stereotype, and maybe that's actually the person who would be able to give the best input in relation to a specific challenge that the organisation might be facing. Okay, the last reference document for you now, again, I would suspect at this stage, coming close to the exam, perhaps this is something that people are not going to have the time to do, and I would hope that that's still going to be okay if you've got a good working knowledge of this topic. It shouldn't be one that would have a disproportionate amount of marks, and you should be able to score some good solid marks in it based on a kind of just a basic fundamental understanding of it. So if you wish, there is a presentation from Kevin Scholes, who's obviously 1/3 of Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, going through the various lenses, and you'll find that in the rear of my course notes starting on page 267. Okay, so the 3 past paper questions, as I mentioned, you can see the first 2 were in question 1. They were both 10 markers. So certainly we're not saying that it's okay for you to get no marks for both of those 10 markers, but by the same token, it's not really kind of realistic and pragmatic to be saying to somebody, well, you must be getting 7 or 8 out of 10 for those. Really what you must be getting, if you're going to be getting 70 or 80% of the marks for a question, you really want that to be for 1A if it's a 20 marker and 1B if it's a 20 marker, etc. Now you certainly, as I said, you do not want to get 0 marks for any question if at all possible, particularly those that are in the compulsory part of the paper. So there is kind of a happy medium to try and ensure that you adopt here. Okay, so this is the one we'll be coming back to in a few moments. This is the one where I've worked out the indicative answer. So Johnson, Scholes and Whittington defined the 3 strategy lenses: design, experience and ideas. So that was given to you in the question. And then examine the different insights each of these lenses gives to the understanding the process of strategy development at the National Museum. Now, the first time this was asked, obviously, a very broad verb, examine, so you weren't really kind of required to talk about any specific implications. You had a very, very broad instruction there, and we'll work through that now in a few moments, and you'll see how you could have examined the different insights. So in other words, if the National Museum and the way they develop strategy was put against those 3 different lenses, what would your view be? So for example, well, which lens was being used in the museum, and maybe which lens should they be using, and why were they not using it, etc. So that's what we look at in a few moments. Now, before we go on to that, let's just very quickly look at the other one. Johnson, Scholes and Whittington identified 3 strategy lenses: design, experience and ideas. Evaluate. Now, this was much more judgment based. And on the basis that there had been a past paper question, the examiner certainly felt within his rights to maybe, slightly up the standard and say, well, what I want you to do now is not, examine and make a kind of a commentary about how the lenses may have applied in an organization. I want you to kind of, apply some judgment here. And, how important or how appropriate would be the design lens for Midshire Health, or how appropriate or important or suitable would the experience lens be, and similarly the ideas lens. So did you have a situation where this organization maybe was used to using a particular lens, and that lens isn't fit for purpose? They really need to kind of take that lens off and put on a different one and look at strategy through a different lens. So it's the same destination, it's the same vista, if you want to call it that way, but the better way for you to get a more focused strategy and a clearer picture. So if I can continue on the analogy, like I mentioned early on in the presentation, there is the group shot that you want to take of people at a wedding. It's pretty important that you put the right lens on the camera for the best outcome. You could use other lenses and, they would deliver some sort of an outcome, or there would be a photograph at the end of it, but it wouldn't be a very good photograph. So the same thing here, there's an organization, you're looking at the organization through a kind of a device, a strategy device. It's important that you put on the right lens, otherwise the strategy that you develop, the strategy document that you're using, it will be a strategic document, it will be a strategic plan, it just won't be the best plan. So that was a little bit more of a step up. Now, just before we talk about the third one, which unfortunately wasn't published, be aware of the fact that there is a possibility that the next time that Johnson, Scholes and Whittington strategy lenses is asked, the examiner might not give you the three lenses. That might be something that you're required to demonstrate your level of comfort, that you're so comfortable with the topic that you don't even have to be reminded what the three lenses are. But I would like to think that there's an outside chance that would happen. Okay, so unfortunately the most recent question of the strategy lenses was not published. March 16, question 2A. The only thing we do know from the examiner's report is as follows. The first part of this question asks candidates to examine the evidence, if any, of each of the strategy lenses and the strategic development to date in the company described in the question scenario. So again, this is nearly hinting at, and it's kind of getting on to a more deeper understanding of these lenses, is not really suitable for an organization to slavishly follow just one of the lenses or just use one of the lenses. Now, there might be very much a need and a necessity for them to have one of the lenses dominating how they view strategy. So go back to my example, the engineering company should very much be looking at strategy through a design lens, but they should sometimes also, take off the design lens, put on the experience lens, and then sometimes put on the ideas lens, and then take basically, those three viewpoints, those three perspectives, and then on the basis of that, they would be able to come up with the best well-rounded strategy. Okay, so let's go back to the question that we're going to take a look at and try and work through a solution on it. So Johnson, Scholes and Whittington have divided three strategy lenses: design, experience and ideas. Examine the different insights each of these lenses give to the understanding the process of strategy development at the National Museum. So in a nutshell, let's just basically look at what happened in this situation and how the design, experience and ideas lenses might be in your answer. So the first thing is, we're talking about a museum, if you get a chance to read this case study, and a new Director General was effectively imposed on the museum because the government, which had previously 90% funded the museum, was dramatically reducing its funding. And the Director General looked at strategy through very much a design lens. So he had been given a set of parameters. He'd been told, look, here's the time frame, here is the budget reduction, and what you have to do now is come up with a plan to accommodate that. Oh, and by the way, there's a second set of parameters. We need you to work on providing more social inclusion and going after certain demographics that up until now haven't really visited this kind of old-fashioned, stuffy, maybe snobby museum. So in the case study, it's quite clear to see that the Director General viewed strategy very much through a design lens. And to a certain extent, I think an awful lot of accounting students reading that would have said, I can totally understand where he's coming from. He'd been given a clear a brief, a clear set of requirements by the client, if you want to use it that expression. He went away, looked at all the various variables, crunched various numbers, came up with a plan, and decided to roll out that plan. And to a certain extent, in many organizations, that would be a perfectly acceptable way. However, the problem is that the organization in which he was trying to maybe impose this design lens plan or this design lens strategy, was an organization that was used to viewing strategy in no other way than through the experience lens. And the idea would be is that the museum had kind of, through its own heritage, had built up a collective experience. There'd been an accumulation of corporate knowledge within that organization, and that's the way that they looked at strategy. So again, this kind of almost a thing that, we've been doing this very well for decades. Why would we need to make radical changes now? Well, that ignores the fact that there have been absolutely massive radical changes in the macro environment in the form of the government slashing their funding of the museum. So, your experience of the past number of decades, and that would have a huge amount of value within the organization and really be treasured and be respected, it has really kind of almost become redundant because external events have completely overtaken that experience. So that experience is fine, but that's the good old days. It really doesn't have much currency in the modern environment. So any changes would have been very incremental in this organisation, whereas the new Director General has designed a strategy that's going to see radical, dramatic changes within the organisation. So things not previously experienced, when you're looking at things through an experience lens, they cause huge problems because the organisation has built up this habit of looking at strategy in this type of a very incremental type of a way, and they just don't have the wherewithal to radically change their view and their perspective and change the lens. And lastly then, how the ideas lens would apply here is that there was nearly a complete absence. We could clearly see in this case study the Director General was very much coming from the design lens view of strategy. He was trying to basically force people in an organisation to use that lens rather than the experience lens, which is what they would have been very comfortable with. And on that basis, there was no evidence really of the organisation having any type of perspective or any type of a view of strategy through an ideas lens. It was a very hierarchical and deferential culture within the organisation. So, the idea here is that the major changes that they were going to experience, perhaps having an ideas lens and people coming up with radical and innovative and out of the box, out of the comfort zone types of ideas and ways of doing things, what was possibly very much needed. So following either of the two previous lenses to their extreme and to the exclusion of the ideas lens wouldn't be useful either. So that's the idea in relation to how it applied there. So in a quick nutshell, that's how it applied in this particular case. Now, to look at some very specific examples. Now, for those of you that maybe are very rushed in terms of your exam preparation at this stage, you may decide, look, I'm just going to have to throw this part under the bus. So maybe this is as far as you'll go in the presentation. For others, if you just give me a few minutes, I'll just go through these bit by bit. So if you look at page 46 of the practice and revision kit and go down to paragraph 3, you'll see here there's some pretty obvious evidence to the fact that the current lens in this organisation is an experience lens. The Board of Trustees of the National Museum divide the museum's income between departments roughly on the basis of the previous year's budget plus an inflation percentage. And that's what they're used to doing over decades or maybe even centuries if the museum is hundreds of years old. And that's what they have been conditioned and kind of taught to do. So very much that's the type of lens that you're dealing with. And again, because of the massive macro environmental pastel and particularly P of pastel political issues in this case study, using that lens is not really going to be appropriate in the future and going forward. The next one then was, you can see kind of, more of this as well. Collective experience. This is what's important in the organisation. The head of each section is an important position, enjoys many privileges, a large office, special section heads, dining room, dedicated PA. So those people with the experience are the people in the organisation that are valued the most. That mightn't necessarily mean qualifications. So somebody who is hugely qualified coming in from the outside and then designing a strategy, that's not really going to be treated with any type of respect because you're not from this group. These are the people who come up with strategy, the experienced people. So what the hell would you know? You're an outsider. Well, in this situation, if they're facing now challenges that have more in common with how a private sector organisation operates, well then maybe the very person that you want to be designing your strategy is somebody with that type of skill set and that type of experience. And also you can see that again, that is further reinforced then, how important that experience is that, you get this very deferential title, so you're called professor, and, mainly that is to do with your experience, and, they're the people who are responsible for strategy. Okay, on page 47 then, if you go on to the next page, you'll see in paragraph 1, the government have asked all museums to produce a strategy document showing how they intend to meet these financial, accessibility and technological objectives. Now, the intent there could have been an awful lot clearer if the narrative had said that this is the first time they'd been asked to do this. So, this organisation, really, to drive home the fact that they never really looked at strategy through a design lens, they had never previously been required to produce this type of a strategy document. Whereas, somebody viewing strategy as through a design lens, there would be a view in their mind that I will know when I finish this process, I have finished designing the strategy, when there is a document that I'm going to be able to distribute to people. So that could have been a little bit clearer, but it was hinting at the fact that, again, the dominant or the traditional way of this organisation viewing a strategy was very much through an experience lens. And we don't need to write that stuff down, we don't need to document it, everybody knows, there's a taken for granted assumption that this is the way we do things. And then on the last one on this slide, if we look at paragraph 2 on page 47, now it's quite a large paragraph, there's a couple of elements to this. So again, traditionally, so a huge emphasis on tradition and customs, and there was a big cultural web question as part of this question 1 as well. So it was really complementary in terms of emphasizing that the experience lens was really the lens that was being used in the organization now. So traditionally there was a routine, there was a ritual, to use the cultural web expression, of providing administrative support for sections grouped beneath a director of admin. The role of DG had been a part-time post. Well, there's a perfect example of its collective experience. So there's no single individual who basically is, finalising strategy and imposing that in a top-down type of a structure. What happens is the heads of the various departments within the museum, they come together collectively and they use a combination of their experience to formulate strategy. So this was a completely new departure, and again, there was going to be maybe some resistance to this. It's appropriate for the Director General to now be full-time and for them to design a strategy, but there was going to be challenges with trying to get people to accept that maybe a new lens needed to be used when viewing strategy, rather than the experience lens that had been the lens that was used up until now. So the funding changes had required to produce this strategy document, so something needed to be designed, and this is something, it's a change. There was no prior experience of this. The trustees felt they needed private industry expertise, so somebody with a very different type of experience. And the Director General was previously CEO of a chain of supermarkets, where, we would expect that very much the design lens is the lens that's used, and that would be totally appropriate to that type of an organisation. And, there was going to be effectively a culture clash between somebody who is using a design lens which had been tried and tested and accepted in a certain industry, for decades as the way of actually designing strategy, pardon the pun, designing strategy, and then trying to convince people in an organisation where it's all based on experience and know-how and kind of, being battle hardened and have been, in the museum for 30 or 40 years, and trying to convince those people that maybe that experience and that looking at strategy through that type of a lens doesn't maybe have the value that it once did, and that's going to be a big challenge for certain individuals. Okay, a couple of last examples then. On page 48, if you look at item number 1, you'll again see, a very kind of a radical departure for the museum, but again, the stereotypical accountant looking at this is, look, this is just completely logical, it's rational, it's linear. So, rather than allocating budgets based on some sort of fuzzy-wuzzy kind of experience, what we're going to do is use cold, hard numbers. So those collections that have the most visitors, they'll get the most money. And, you can imagine, coming up with that type of a design, it sounds perfectly logical. In fact, anything else sounds completely illogical. But again, that would be going very much against the experience of the organisation up until now. Okay, on the next page, all right, page 49, so this is the last page of the narrative, you'll see another extract here. I've just, cut these all out effectively verbatim from the case just to illustrate that, the data and the information is there. So this is in response to the strategy that had been designed by the new Director General. So a person in the museum said, quote, "This is a dreadful idea and confuses popularity with historical significance, as previous governments have realised what is important is the value of the collection. Heritage collections recognise this significance by putting the nation's interests before those of an undiscerning public." So again, the critical thing to watch out, as previous governments have realised, we're not dealing with previous governments anymore. And the new government, and they've been supported by the main opposition party, the narrative tells us that, are radically changing the funding model. So these guys are just in denial. And saying, look, as previous governments are totally irrelevant. You're not dealing with previous governments, and even if the current government loses the next election, the opposition are going to maintain the same policy. So sorry, the lens you've been using up until now, this experience lens, which might have served your organisation well, it's just no longer viable. You're going to have to come up and design a different way of doing things based on these cold, hard facts. So talking about kind of, the good old days or stuff like that, it's just not going to be appropriate in this situation. And then the last one then is, there's two little parts to this. If you look at paragraph 2 on page 49, this is people within the organisation, they were particularly critical of the lack of consultation. Again, what purpose would consultation serve? The government have issued an edict. The Director General has been given this, set of criteria, and he has to come up with a plan to basically accommodate that. So having a consultation and having some sort of tea and biscuits to discuss what they're going to do is effectively irrelevant. Unless they're going to actually have consultation as to how they're going to achieve what the government have stipulated. But having some sort of a consultation and, that they're going to try and fight what the government are saying and explain to the government they're wrong is just completely pointless. They'd be far better off sitting down and designing a plan that can operate within those constraints. So these proposals will be produced with no input from museum staff. You'd say, well, what input is going to be constructive, because the museum staff are coming to this from an experience that is completely different to the new reality. And you'd wonder how well able they would be in a position to come up with a strategy to accommodate the new situation. So maybe it's better that a person is appointed and they go off and try and design a strategy that best accommodates the museum, while at the same time, accepting the new reality, accepting the new funding model. So they've been handed down from on high by an ex-grocer, says one anonymous contributor. So again, you can see that this is where there's the big clash. The organisation is viewed strategy very much as an experience, whereas this private sector operator has come in and said, look, here's the situation. I go off now and develop a plan, and that plan then is implemented. I effectively, I order my staff to do it. So that was why there was a problem in this case. Okay, so hopefully, that has thoroughly explained how it would apply here, and between, the examples and going through all the stuff, hopefully now you'd have a very good, strong working knowledge. If you want to take a look at an indicative answer to this particular question, you'll find it in my course notes. Now, just be careful about that. Normally, my indicative answers are in my practice and revision kit, so it's in my course notes on page 273. And again, what you will see there obviously is a more realistic version as to what somebody could do in the exam given the time constraints, and much briefer than the sample solution. So 273, you obviously see my introduction. 274 is the actual 10-mark indicative answer. And then on 275, you'll see some other additional points that you could make, so swap them in and out in contrast to some of the ones that I've selected as part of my specific answer. Okay, so that concludes the presentation. Again, just in summary, I would suggest that the strategy lenses on the basis of the infrequency which is asked is a 40% topic. To go back to that mantra again about preparing for P3 properly, it's essential that 60% of the course to 100% proficiency. Now, it's very difficult, to say what is that 60%, but I think the strategy lenses, we could be fully confident in saying it's not part of that 60%. It will be part of the 40%, these peripheral topics that do crop up from time to time. Having said that, it's not a wise approach that you would know nothing about those topics that are part of the other 40%. If at all possible, you should at least know something about them, and hopefully that presentation has put you in a position to be able to do that. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.